talk about pressures in the cardiovascular system, we're talking about blood pressure. Pressures in different parts of the cardiovascular system aren't equal, and these differences in pressures keep the blood moving from high pressure areas leaving the heart, like the arteries, to low pressure areas like the veins. Actually though, the pressure curve looks a little more like this, and fluctuates in the arteries depending on what part of the cardiac cycle it's in. These peaks correspond to systole, and these low points correspond to diastole. That being said though, this original line is the average of these fluctuations, or the mean arterial pressure, sometimes just shortened to MAP. Now, since systole takes up about a third of a single cardiac cycle, and diastole takes up the remaining 2/3 of the cycle, we can calculate the mean arterial pressure at any time by the equation mean arterial pressure equals 1/3 times the systolic blood pressure plus 2/3 times the diastolic blood pressure. So, for example, if the systolic blood pressure is 120 millimeters of mercury, which is the unit we use for blood pressure, and the diastolic blood pressure is 80 millimeters of mercury, plugging the numbers in, this becomes 1/3 times 120 plus 2/3 times 80, or a mean arterial pressure of roughly 93 millimeters of mercury. Another value we can look at is the pulse pressure, which is the difference between the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. In this scenario, the pulse pressure would be 120 minus 80, or 40 millimeters of mercury. If we do a little rearranging to this equation, we get systolic blood pressure equals diastolic blood pressure plus pulse pressure. And then substituting that into our last equation, we get mean arterial pressure equals 1/3 times the quantity diastolic blood pressure plus pulse pressure plus 2/3 the diastolic blood pressure. And then after distributing, we get the equation mean arterial pressure equals diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 the pulse pressure. Now, looking at these fluctuations on the arterial side, there's a couple important things to notice. First of all, on the downswing of the curve, there's a sharp pressure drop followed by a rise again, forming what's called the dicrotic notch, or incisura. As blood is ejected out into the aorta, pressure rises really fast. And then as the heart starts to relax, a tiny amount of blood flows back into the ventricle, which causes the valve to snap shut and the pressure to fall. That snapping shut of the valve causes it to recoil back a little bit into the aorta, which causes a brief increase in the pressure of the aorta. And then finally, the pressure falls as the aortic valve settles. A second interesting thing to notice is that the pulse pressure in the large arteries downstream of the aorta is larger than in the aorta itself. There are a couple of reasons why this happens. One is that the pressure wave from the contraction of the heart travels a tiny bit faster than the blood itself. To help kind of understand this idea, think of the molecules and cells in the blood like Newton's cradle. And while they move together, they bump into each other and end up transmitting that pressure wave faster than the group can move as a whole, meaning that that pressure wave actually ends up adding to the pressure downstream, therefore making the pressure higher in the large arteries. A second reason is that the pressure waves bounce off branch points in the arteries, which cause them to reflect back and increase the pressure in the arteries even more. Alright, so it should seem a little weird that both the systolic pressure and the pulse pressure are higher in the downstream arteries, since we know that blood wants to move from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. But one thing to remember is that in the large arteries, the diastolic pressure is lower. And remember that it's the mean arterial pressure that drives blood flow. And this is mostly affected by diastolic pressure, which is highest in the aorta. As an example with some numbers, let's say that the aorta's systolic blood pressure is 115 and the diastolic blood pressure is 85, meaning pulse pressure is 30. That said, the mean arterial pressure ends up being 95 millimeters of mercury. Now, if the large artery's systolic blood pressure is 120, which is higher than the aorta, and diastolic blood pressure is 80, which is lower than the aorta, then the pulse pressure ends up being 40, which is also higher than the aorta. But we see that the mean arterial pressure ends up being 93 millimeters of mercury, which is actually lower than in the aorta like we'd expect. Alright, so as we move out of the arterial tree, the pressure gets lower and lower as the arteries branch out into smaller and smaller arteries, and then arterioles and then capillaries. As those vessels branch into smaller and smaller arterioles, resistance goes up. According to the equation, flow rate Q equals change in pressure, or pressure initial minus pressure final, divided by resistance. With increased resistance, the pressure final or downstream pressure must decrease, which increases the change in pressure and keeps the flow rate constant. Across the capillaries, the pressure drops from 30 to 10 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure drop is greater across the arterioles than the capillaries, even though the capillaries are even smaller, which means even more resistance. The pressure drop here is less though because there are so many capillaries that run in parallel to one another, and that helps to reduce the total resistance, since total resistance for vessels in parallel is less than the resistance in any one individual vessel. After the capillaries, blood goes into the venules and then the larger veins. At this point, the pressure drops aren't very big at all, because the blood vessels have a larger and larger radius and have a high compliance, and can expand to hold more blood. Finally, blood makes it to the vena cava, and pressure is roughly 4 millimeters of mercury, and the right atrial pressure is around 2 millimeters of mercury. Even though there are only small differences in pressure, it's still enough to move blood back to the heart, even when it's going against gravity. Now, various clinical situations can cause pressures in the system to go up or down, and that affects all of the downstream pressures as well. As an example, let's take a closer look at the normal aortic pressure curve, and then two situations that often alter aortic pressures. The first is arteriosclerosis, which is a chronic condition where the arteries become stiff and less compliant, kind of like a rubber hose turning into a lead pipe over time. The baseline diastolic pressure usually doesn't change, but the extra volume of blood that exerts pressure on the walls during systole results in enormous increases in systolic pressure because the walls are so stiff. The high systolic pressure with the unchanged diastolic pressure means that there's also an increased pulse pressure, and therefore an increased mean arterial pressure. The second example is aortic stenosis, which is a narrowing of the aortic valve which increases its resistance. With increased resistance, the change in pressure must also increase, which means there's a decrease in the pressure after the valve, or the final pressure. The diastolic pressure again remains unchanged, but there's a decreased systolic pressure, decreased pulse pressure, and therefore decreased mean arterial pressure. Alright, so this whole bit that we just talked about is the systemic circulation. But once blood gets to the right atrium, it enters into the right ventricle and the pulmonary circulation. So here in the pulmonary arteries, the pressure is 25 millimeters of mercury during systole and 8 millimeters of mercury during diastole, which means that the mean arterial pressure in the pulmonary artery is 25 times 1/3 plus 8 times 2/3 equals 14 millimeters of mercury. That pressure drops to about 10 millimeters of mercury in the capillaries, to 8 millimeters of mercury in the pulmonary vein, and then 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury in the left atrium. Alright, as a quick recap, vascular pressures drive blood flow because the blood always wants to move from high pressure to lower pressure. The reason that blood pressure falls as the blood moves away from the heart is that blood has to get through many blood vessels, each of which typically offers a little more resistance. In the arteries, there are also pulsations or pressure fluctuations, and they get larger in the downstream arteries and then disappear in the arterioles. But mean arterial pressure always falls as the blood goes downstream.